Hey everybody, how's it going out there? We're in California at the LSI conference, and I'm with Ashkan Rasuli, who he has an interesting approach to building out quality management systems. So when we talk about medical device companies, obviously they have to have a quality management system. What I'm curious about though, from your perspective, Ashkan, is when a medical device company starts and finishes, that quality management system has gone through something of an evolution.
Yeah.
So what does it look like at the beginning, maybe the beginning, middle, and end, and what are your thoughts about what it takes to build those things out appropriately?
Yeah. So, my manifesto is that you got to take the VSB and Burdensom out of QMS. And so what I'm really getting at is the QMS, if effectively implemented, it is a powerful project management tool. And if you do it right, meaning you balance the short-term burden with the long-term burden, you're actually going to have an optimal product development process. So I'm going to first talk about what generally looks like, and then talk about the ways that it typically goes wrong, and then how to do it optimally. So ideally, the evolution of the QMS kind of follows your business needs and your product development process. And if you think about just the general steps in the product development process, we typically have a phased approach to that, but every phase has an objective, which is pretty intuitive, right? There's that initial phase we call feasibility.
Mm-hmm.
You don't even have your problem you're trying to solve quite defined yet. So you're trying to define the problem and then see if there's a product solution to that. This phase typically involves a lot of iterations, a lot of changes. That is not a phase you want to implement QMS control on. And so I typically call that phase 0. But after you kind of nail down your problem you want to solve and the product that solves it, then you get into, okay, I have a feasible solution, and now let's plan on how we make this a product. That becomes your planning phase. And you got to talk to different stakeholders, different swim lanes. That becomes your phase 1. At the end of phase 1, you've got a product defined, you've got a plan to make it a reality, and there's different paths that you got to go in that, and you get to phase 2. And so phase 2 ends up being executing on that plan to get to a final design. So phase 2, the objective really is, I got a final product design. Then you get into testing, right? We call that phase 3, or verification of med devices. The point of testing is, does the product I designed meet the product I defined?
Yeah.
Right? And so it's just going back to my product definition from phase 1, possibly updated in phase 2, and making sure that it meets that definition. After that, the product I defined, did it actually solve the problem I was trying to solve?
Yeah.
So that becomes validation. So that's phase 4. And then once you validate it, you're like, yes, it does solve that problem. Then you get into, okay, getting ready to sell. So everything that goes into that, we call it design transfer in phase 5, but that would be your regulatory clearance. That would be things like manufacturing, scale up, getting your suppliers in line. All of that ready to go to market, sell, and scale up. Mm-hmm. And then after that, you got your post-market maintenance, updating the product, sustainability activities, that kind of stuff. So I just outlined phases 0 to 6, all the way from scrambling to we got a product and selling in the market. And so those are the typical phases. Now, ideally, you would have your quality management system at every phase getting ready to support the next phase, because the quality management system is a system of procedures that assigns roles and responsibilities to people, according to which then people need to act and create records as objective evidence of following the procedure, ultimately to show the objective of the procedure we're meeting, right?
Yeah.
And so you want to be ready for that next phase, one phase in advance. What actually happens though often is people implement QMS according to the enforcement points. And so one of the realities of medtech development is the enforcement points of having a QMS come later. Typically at product launch is when people think of
I like that, yeah.
Right?
That's a good, I actually like that phase a lot, or that phrase a lot, yes. Enforcement points. Because one of the things that I think about, and I don't mean to cut you off necessarily,
No.
I'd love to get back into this, but if we go outside medtech, there are words that we use like protocol and procedure and different things, and they can be a little bit intimidating. I'll just use an example for like let's say a fitness regime. Maybe you're talking about this certain protocol for this certain goal that you want to have for a fitness regime. Well, you call it a workout plan, that makes it easier for me to metabolize. You call it a protocol, I think, okay, and actually a doctor sent me a protocol for a certain reducing a certain type of infection or something. And I'm thinking, you're going to send me a protocol? As a friend of mine actually was like, yeah, let me send you that protocol. It was just a sheet of instructions. And I think sometimes we scare ourselves with these, quality management system, but like you said, it's the set of procedures or the plans that you're going to put in place for these different activities, and then there are different enforcement 100%. Points. I love that.
Yeah, one of the first principles in the Agile Manifesto is quality over proceduralism, and what I'm trying to get at is exactly what you just said. Proceduralism is having procedures for the sake of procedures, but quality is understanding the objective that the procedure is about to achieve and understanding your role in that, right?
Yeah.
So, if you've got a risk management procedure, it sounds scary, right? But the goal of a risk management procedure is something we do every day, which is making sure the risk is acceptable for what it is we're about to do, given the benefits.
Yeah.
That's all.
How bad is this thing going to hurt somebody, and can we fix that, prevent it from
and
happening?
if not, if there's some residual risk, it's possible. Is it worth it?
Yeah, let's take that into account, absolutely.
Because that's a decision. Every day when you step outside, when you drive a car, you're assuming a certain level of risk, but it's worth the benefit. So that's an assessment you're doing every day. We just call it the risk management procedure, and we make it structured in medical device development.
So the enforcement points make sense, and maybe it would be worth talking about those different enforcement points, because I would expect a heightened sense of formalization at each one of those points. So in the early stages, let's say feasibility, what procedures or official, unofficial, enforced, not enforced, audited, not audited, we can talk about all those different things. I don't want to go necessarily into that depth, but what do you recommend a company at that level have? And then maybe we can go on to just kind of outline the different enforcement points that you're talking about here.
Yeah, so the feasibility being the early stage with a lot of rapid iteration where the problem and product are not yet defined completely is actually one that least benefits from having structure. The quality management system is about control of different objectives you're trying to achieve. One of the first things we do, we define a quality manual, quality policy, quality objectives, right?
Yeah.
And so we got objectives, how do we achieve them? We keep controlling. And control necessarily does have a burden associated with it. It does necessarily slow you down a bit. But also, if you know that what you have is a prototype to be changed 25 other times, the control immediately becomes invalid, and therefore you get no benefits, you just get the burden.
Yeah.
And so in phase 0, I would actually argue that you don't want any formal procedures. What I would actually start thinking about in phase 0 is building a quality culture, which is more making sure the team's on the same page about the heavy responsibility of developing a medical device, making sure everyone's aligned about patient safety. That is kind of what we're focusing on. And you kind of build that culture just to set yourself up for success in the following phases.
Right. I can almost see, because I agree with you, sometimes the chaos is necessary to get things.
Yes.
And chaos is too extreme of a word, but like you said, the formal controls, you might not benefit from that at the very beginning. However, and I'm curious what you think about this, is when you go through and start developing that early stage feasibility, defining the problem, defining all those things, those aren't necessarily, they shouldn't necessarily be controlled by your quality management system, but they should be inputs to how your quality management system is going to function later on, or how your design controls, your risk management is going to. Would you agree that
100%.
That's also going to go?
Well, so actually, when you're talking about product definition in phase 1 planning, I would argue that a QMS implemented effectively at that stage starts working on the quality manual, but also the quality policy. And the question you're trying to answer with a quality policy really is, what role does quality play in my product presentation?
Yeah.
Is it only going to be the bare minimum necessary to check a box and be allowed into the market? That's the one end of the range, because you can't be less than the bare minimum, you just won't be granted access. Or am I going to go above and beyond and in fact make quality a differentiator of my product? One thing worth noting here is the 13485 standard, which is the basis for medical device design and development, was built on top of 9001, and ultimately the goal of 9001, if you go through it, is to establish a system where you consistently meet customer requirements. And you get to define customer requirements.
Yeah.
And so this is part of why I say a quality management system effectively implemented is just good project management. This is how you consistently build quality systems. And so in phase one, in your product definition, the executive management must make a decision of what role does quality play in my go-to-market strategy.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the enforcement point.
Yes.
When does it start needing to be enforced and controlled?
So there are two enforcement points that are typically driving activities in a startup. You see, startups, for the most part, with scarce resources, try to postpone that which is not immediately necessary. There's obviously the regulatory enforcement of, if you're in the States, the FDA, if you're in the EU, your notified body. However, those typically come at product launch. That basically gates your product launch. If you're a PMA, you're gated by an inspection. If you are a class 2 or class 1, you're still supposed to have it at product launch,
right?
Even though there's no inspection. The other category of external enforcement points typically ends up coming from investors. Investors, as a part of their due diligence, depending on the stage of the company and long term, actually require that you have some sort of a regulatory strategy, some sort of a quality strategy, and show them how far down the road you are. And so typically, startups start thinking of this stuff when one of those external enforcement points arrive.
Right.
I would argue that this ends up typically being a case of short-term gains sacrificing long-term efficiency. And in fact, it is one of the primary contributors to what I call BS in a QMS, a burdensome
The burdensome
QMS.
approach, yeah.
Yeah. Because what really happens is you end up having spent a long amount of time, sometimes years. The average time from inception to PMA for class 3 devices is 13 years. So that's obviously class 2 devices shorter, but that's the kind of timeline we're talking about. Sometimes you spend years iterating on the design, testing and all that, and then you're like, I got to establish a QMS. You got to go retrospectively, remediate all of that. The quality is not going to be great. It's going to feel burdensome. It's going to be all at the same time, and it is not necessarily going to be value added. And so, ideally, you would prep for the stage after, before with your procedures. So, I talked about how if you're in phase one, you're defining the product. That's a great time to start thinking quality policy, quality manual, quality objectives, management review. Get the management position on where does quality stand. But also prep yourself for phase two, which is going to be product design. And so that's going to be things like the PDP process, the product development process. If you got software, it's the software development lifecycle, how are we going to go about designing this thing? The risk management process, because risk management is a part of your product design. It gives you inputs into design. You don't want to be thinking you're done with the design only for quality to last minute come in with 5 mitigations you need to build in that take you 5 months.
Right.
Yeah.
Or cybersecurity. I mean, there's lots of different inputs there. Yeah,
exactly.
That makes total sense.
There's a lot of different inputs that, if not implemented early on, is going to just delay whatever target launch you have later on. Yeah. And so, in the same vein, getting ready for testing, verification. In phase two, then, you want to make sure you've thought of your software V&V procedures, your product V&V procedures, your sampling plans. How is usability going to look? Do we need to do any formative testing? Do we need to do summative testing? What does that look like? What is the scope of that? Basically set yourself up for executing in phase three. Then in phase three, you want to get ready for phase four. Whether you got clinical studies that you're sponsoring or you're doing in-house basically, and you need a 14155 compliant set of procedures, or if you're gonna, outsource to a CRO, those are decisions to be made. So get yourself set up for what user validation and clinical validation looks like. Then in phase four, get yourself set up for phase five, which is going to be all the manufacturing procedures, IQ, OQ, PQ, process validations, the equipment manufacturing, the maintenance, suppliers, the clearance, and then get yourself ready for post-market surveillance in phase 5.
If you could just give one piece of advice to startups and, I don't know, early stage companies who are thinking about, well, do I need a QMS? I don't need QMS right now, or do I need a QMS right now? What would be the piece of advice that you would give them, and just to kind of close this conversation out?
I would say start small and do a little bit of time, and it's going to not seem like a burden it is. Often I see it become a burden because it is not thought of early, and so what happens is what could have been just like maybe hours a month, maybe like 4 hours a month for everyone, over a period, ends up being a huge milestone to drive to.
Yeah, I think it's good advice. Well, cool. Thank you so much, Ashkan.
Thank you,
Hope
Atiya.
you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, you too.